Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 IPR Research Symposium. Let me get my notes out. I should have done that a minute ago. My name is Tina McCorkindale, and I'm the president and CEO of the Institute for Public Relations. The IPR Research Symposium is our special way of saying thank you to all our IPR supporters. We would much rather have held this in person, but we're happy to do virtual. But we have a really great program for you, and this is one of our biggest turnouts yet. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. In the chat, we have included a link to the agenda so you can see what's happening. And we also have a link to the bios. So we're not going to go into great detail with each individual presenter's bios. Instead, you can refer to that through the program. The other thing that you should know that may help you is that if you're seeing Lauren's screen, and you have people overlapping with the PowerPoint, there's a way so you can see it so it's side by side, and I'll tell you how to do that. You can go up to, you are viewing Lauren Day's screen, and if you go under view options, you can then click on side by side. That way you see the panelists and they're not going over the PowerPoint. Let's see what else. If you have any questions, you can enter them in the Q&A. The chat should be open, so you're welcome to use that as well. And any resources that our presenters share, we will send to you all following the event. We will also record this presentation and send this out in a few days. Okay, and let's see what I missed. We have a great program, so let's get right into it. So our first presentation of the day, I'm really excited about this, is led by Lauren Day and Alan Sexton. Lauren is one of our great IPR trustees, and before December 1st was the Chief Communications Officer at Prudential Financial, leading an integrated insight-led team that generates competitive advantage for Prudential and its diversified business worldwide. Prior to December 1st, Alan led communications for Prudential's global portfolio of business with responsibility for expanding and elevating the strategic counsel, portfolio perspective, and thematic insights provided to the company's US and international business lines. As of yesterday, he's now in the CCO role. So congrats to the both of you. And I've seen this presentation and I love it. I love just the way of thinking, and these are two brilliant people. So Lauren and Alan, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Tina. And yes, it's a big congratulations for Alan is in order. He has absolutely been one of the architects of the work that we're going to be sharing today. And now it comes to continuing the implementation of some of these ideas. And we're going to give you an overview of that work today. And without we want to start off with a story. Alan's going to talk about a story that I think will lay the groundwork for what we're going to communicate today, which is the role of an ecosystem. What is an ecosystem in the modern business context, and what is the role of communications within that ecosystem? So with that, I'd like to ask Alan to start with a story.
Sure, thanks, Lauren. And hello, everybody. We're delighted to be here today, at least virtually with all of you. And we're looking forward to this discussion. So this story starts on a very bitterly cold Sunday morning in February, almost more than 100 years ago, when someone dropped a cigar end on the floor of the Hearst building in downtown Baltimore. That still smoldering cigar slipped through a gap in the floorboards, fell into a dry goods store located in the building's basement, and started what would become one of the most destructive fires in US history for many years. The fire quickly engulfed more than 10 square blocks, began spreading east towards Baltimore City Hall. And George Horton, who was Baltimore's fire chief at the time, pretty quickly realized how dire the situation was and started to call for help from all of the surrounding communities, who responded en masse. And thus began one of the largest movements of firefighting personnel actually since the Civil War. When this growing battalion of men and resources, and they were all men at that time, arrived in downtown Baltimore, they could do nothing to help. Unfortunately and amazingly, they were powerless. And as darkness fell on Baltimore, on downtown Baltimore, and the fire raged on, actually a fire that could be seen apparently as far away as Washington, D.C., hundreds of these firefighters stood around watching the city burn to the ground. So what was stopping them? The problem was amazingly and maddeningly simple. The issue was that they couldn't connect their equipment to the local firefighting system. The couplings that connected hoses and hydrants in and around Baltimore were a different size to the equipment used by fire departments in other cities. The diameters and the threads varied from place to place at that time. There was no standardization. In other words, all the firefighters and water on the eastern seaboard wasn't sufficient to save Baltimore because they couldn't connect the pieces and make them work together as a whole. And in the absence of an integrated response to the fire, the scale and the speed of the blaze and how it spread just simply overwhelmed the local firefighters who were able to train their hoses on the blaze. Ultimately, the Baltimore fire would burn for about the next about another 30 hours. It consumed 70 square blocks of downtown Baltimore, caused about $150 million of damage in 1904 terms, which is about $4 billion today. And since we're both with Prudential Financial and we are in the business of insurance, just an aside that only about half of that damage was insured. And 35,000 Baltimoreans found themselves unemployed. It took about 2 years, in fact, for the city to rebuild. So here we are more than a century later. The world is obviously a very different place than the one pictured in the photo that you see. And as we know, and as 2020 has really laid bare, the world is a lot more complicated and interconnected than it was even at that point. And yet we still face some similar challenges, particularly as communicators within Prudential, which is a pretty large, global, complex, and as Tina mentioned a few minutes ago, a diversified business operating in a very heavily regulated space. Despite the fact that we have lots of expertise, lots of communicators and communications expertise scattered across the company, and the fact that we're expending considerable effort and money on communications, we're still struggling to connect the dots and bring the right resources to bear on the right problem in the right place when it's needed most. And integration really lies at the heart of our problem, our challenge at Pru, and the solution that we propose to Prudential's leadership team, which we will now take you through.
So, as Alan said, all of the resources on the eastern seaboard could do nothing against a raging fire if connection points had not been anticipated or addressed. And that's an important theme. But first, let's talk about ecosystems. I'm going to go quickly through some basics of ecosystems. Many of you probably know this, but I think it's important to just do a little bit of a recap because we're going to build on this to talk about the role of communication. So what are they? How do ecosystems help us redefine what the discipline of communications is and should be? And how can you as communicators help strengthen your company's ecosystem? So, ecosystems introduce new ways to compete, collaborate, and consume. So a lot of value is both created and unlocked when you think in terms of business as an ecosystem. Actors, in some instances, may be competing, in other instances, they may be collaborating. At a minimum, it's a mindset in which you think about the world around you in terms of stakeholders with varying relationships to each other in real time. And you have you need to deploy assets that may not actually belong to you directly. So this is the antipode to what you might have learned in business school with respect to vertical or horizontal integration. So it's a hard to depict because it's a three, even 4-dimensional concept. But when you think about your marketplace as groups of communities, you have a different way of thinking about how to extract value in your business. This concept was identified about 30 years ago. It's been around, but very, very important is the notion that as these stakeholders interact and co-evolve, everything is accelerated now by technology. So when you are aware of the speed at which things are evolving and you understand direct and indirect relationships in the ecosystem where you're operating, society is a direct part of that. You're no longer thinking just one step away or about one particular, first degree relationships. You're thinking along you're thinking much, much deeper and longer term than that. So the integrated ecosystem model, oops, I think I skipped a slide here. The traditional linear process, as you can see, is linear and it's cyclical, and frankly, it's very slow. This is much more of a visualization of how we as communicators need to think. And certain groups are not in the center all the time in this model, but think about all of the different groups you work with, who you're serving, and frankly, what problem you're solving is really the idea at the center of an ecosystem. This is very much, sorry for my trigger finger, this happens to me a lot when I'm presenting. Companies are quite, who've really built their companies within the last 20 years, are very astute about the power of ecosystems. Alibaba is a tremendous example of how they've created this is, they don't have to take a legacy infrastructure and figure out how to go back and measure things. They set up an environment from the outset with the right kind of measurement and the right kind of value, a sense of value from the beginning. So the types, they're not looking back at a traditional customer journey, if you will, and going back and saying, well, how did we do? This type of setup with data and value set up at the beginning allows for the ability to predict and move customers much closer to, allows customers to really move, the company to move closer to the customer, and the customer to really dictate where the company spends its energy. Another example that's worth mentioning, especially because the former CEO has been in the news in a very tragic way, has been Zappos. Because in a traditional model, you'd say, oh, Zappos sells shoes, so I guess we should go out and buy the rubber company that supplies the shoes for their rubber soles, or we'll buy the company that supplies the leather. But really, what Zappos is a community of people who at first come together with the need of buying shoes, but once you have the community, you can sell anything into it, and the community can interact in different ways. So that's a US example for that. COVID has highlighted how important ecosystems are in our world. We all knew the importance of supply chains, but I think many people underestimated the interdependencies and codependencies. So when you look at certain vulnerabilities, because if you thought only about your supply chain linearly, COVID is going to expose that. So ecosystems aren't going anywhere. I'd also like to say, I'm so sorry about this. Implications of the ecosystem environment. So if you're already kind of scratching your head a little bit, like this is a lot to absorb, imagine how CEOs feel. Businesses are changing, speed is an issue. There's a deep need for insight and intelligence in real time. Nothing is hidden, but nobody knows what's important. Communications function, and we'll get into this in a minute, a communications function that has a view of the whole ecosystem start to process some of the perspective that you have for the benefit of business decision makers. And because of the complexity of the environment and the interdependencies we've discussed, corporations recognize their impact on others and vice versa, and are much, much more willing than before. This is borne out by all kinds of research and experience, much more willing to be an actor in more complex social and political problems. So,
Lauren, just to
yeah.
Sorry, just to jump in here for a second. One thing that so Pru, I spent more than 20 years in the consulting world before I joined Pru 3 years ago. And I did experience, I experienced the difficulty that large organizations encountered in making sure the left hand, so to speak, knows what the right hand is doing from the outside, from outside clients. And to some extent, particularly with some of the larger global engagements I led or was involved in, that was one of the things that the agency team often did, was help provide that connectivity to enable leaders in different parts of the organization understand what was happening in other parts, not just functionally as well as geographically. And so my experience at Pru, it's been fascinating to see that from the inside, which has, it has been a real education to understand that there really aren't other teams, other functions that provide that level of connectivity between issues, topics, prior, to the extent that the communications function inside a large organization like Prudential actually does. And so I think this is key, just as we're seeing organizations struggle to connect with different issues, evolving issues, dynamic groups or community actors outside, they face similar sorts of challenges, understanding what's happening within their own walls, which are, as we all know, increasingly porous at this point.
Thank you, Alan. And I'm sorry if there's a noise. I don't know what to do because I can't hear it, but I will soon be on mute if that makes things better. Probably does. Just to Alan's point before, I'm going to move very quickly through all of this, and maybe we can address this in the questions. Just as Alan is saying, ecosystems help us reimagine communications as the lateral integrator, the strategic nucleus of a company, the intelligence function of a company. As you know, we have to define communications in a new way, but as a lateral integrator, communications can catalyze outcomes and serve as the glue or the fascia of the company. So you already have many of the tools and perspectives needed to be a connector and integrator across the company where you're serving. You already have a view of the whole, a sense of the comprehensiveness, and you are already doing in the project management, the orchestration, you already have the ability to pull a lot of pieces together to address numerous stakeholders in a dynamic way all the time. So there are 4 perspectives you already have, and it's really a matter of managing them in a way and producing a consequential view for the leaders of your firm. As Alan mentioned, you have an outside-in view. You see from the outside what the perception of your company is. You see completely across the company. No other function has that same view. You're supporting facilities. You're supporting the CEO. You're supporting people. People capital. You have the business view, but you see it all at once. You see it in a very real-time way. Think of the functions who work on real campaign timelines, quarterly timelines. With the outside-in view, portfolio view, and real-time view, you have the right to offer powerful counsel to decision makers. So with that, I'll just conclude and turn this. I don't know how to turn the noise off on my computer, but if you think about the world, the business world and environment in a 3-dimensional way, don't think of communications at the end of the value chain where you just amplify what's been in production, nor are you really just a coordinator along that vertical line. You're much more of, think intelligence. You're an intelligence function, you're an orchestrating function, and the ecosystem mindset is incredibly important. So with that, I will move the slides along as Alan talks about the Prudential case study that has been in the process at our company for about the last 1.5 years.
So as Lauren said, we first launched what at that point was called the Future of Communications project as part of an enterprise-wide series of initiatives, all under the banner of Future of, and particularly Future of Work. And we started by not focusing on communications so much as we focused on the future business needs of the company. We did do some benchmarking at the outset, but it was really an exercise in engaging business leaders and business leaders within Prudential, as well as leaders not just in communications, but in adjacencies outside the firm to see where they thought the future was going. And then within that context, to think about the role that communications could play, and with ecosystems as the backdrop, as the context. Lauren, do you want to? So we did a lot of thinking and visioning in 2019 to arrive at a set of core design principles for the future org model for the communications function. The way we're set up at the moment and have been in the recent past is very much around areas of expertise and to a great extent, around the internal structures of the company itself, which at this point is inherently inefficient. Our communications resources tend to be clumped in different places, depending on historic events and the recent or historic importance of different functions and businesses within a company. They don't necessarily, and in some cases they definitely don't, reflect the company's priorities today nor for the future. So we worked through all of this. We had some very able outside help that again helped to bring an outside-in view about how other organizations beyond financial services and other functions beyond communications were thinking about this. And so ultimately arrived at an outcome, having explored an audience-based model, an expertise-based one, which was a blend of where we are today, and ultimately arrived at the landing place, which was that outcomes-based was going to be the most effective, efficient, and sustainable model over the long term. Partly because we know that given how dynamic the business environment at the moment is, and the fact that pretty much every large organization, certainly every large business, is in the midst of some form of transformation, that ultimately our businesses, our audiences, and the expertise that we would need to engage them and grow in the future, we're all going to change significantly. But ultimately, what wasn't ever going to change was the fact that we would always be looking to achieve specific business outcomes. They would change and be dynamic over time, but we designed the model to adapt and change as those outcomes change themselves. So this is what it looks like. This is not an org chart. We do have org charts that we have built on the basis of this framework. This is what we affectionately have come to refer to as the tartan slide, or I guess maybe on this side of the Atlantic, it could be referred to as the plaid slide. So it depends on where you are in the world. I'll go with tartan because I'm from the other side of the Atlantic. And as you can see here, it's a blend of horizontal and verticals. The horizontals being capabilities based that span the communications organization and the organization as a whole. And then the verticals are outcomes based teams. As you can see here, business growth, an obvious one for any for-profit company. Culture and transformation, which is adjacent to societal change, both of which have become even more important in 2020. Brand reputation and risk management, no surprise there. That's been a mainstay of what we have done as communicators for since the birth of this profession. And then integrated enterprise strategy, both in terms of an integrated communication strategy for the enterprise, as well as its association with the enterprise's business strategy itself. And then just to say a couple of words about the horizontals. The one at the bottom perhaps is the most intriguing and is the place where we have the most work still to do to develop precisely what it is. Traditionally, this would be perhaps referred to as ops, operations, or admin. We are challenging ourselves to think very differently about that, and view it through the lens not just of traditional ops subjects like finance, budgeting, administration, but also to think in terms of learning and development, technology platforms, and partnerships, all falling within that bucket. And again, something that spans the entire communications organization, working with each of the verticals to enable them to achieve the outcomes that have been identified within each of their spaces. We have content development and thought leadership side by side with distribution and amplification. These two have become developed disciplines in their own right. The second one, distribution and amplification, is in so many ways technology driven. And we believe that there's a lot of power to having them closely connected, but making them distinct. Future readiness, we want to make sure that we build into our communications organization a capability where the team's job located within that capability is to always be thinking about the future. Their job is to not think about the work today, but think about what the future holds and how our work needs to change to anticipate and adapt to that future. And then insights and analytics, this is obviously increasingly key. And what we are most focused on here is evolving our existing data and analytics and insights team, which we refer to as the intelligence team, into being something far more than metrics. I think my recent experience in the agency world has been that the stage of evolution often of data and analytics teams within communications functions is that they help to measure what happened. We want to go far beyond that and anticipate what might happen, such that those insights can shape strategy as well as execution in a real-time sense. So this is the tartan slide. A more amorphous version of this, which is getting us a step closer to having an org chart. That the interplay between these, the connection between horizontals and verticals, and you can see in a couple of cases here, you have the corporate brand communications and operations group, which all ladders up through one of my colleagues within the Prudential communications group, is a blend of both horizontal capability and vertical outcome-based team, as is the intelligence team within the communications function, which provides horizontal intelligence to all of the vertical teams, but also creates products and delivers insights as its own vertical, not just to the communications function, but to partners across the enterprise. So this is what the operating model looks like overall, again, based on ecosystem principles, and thinking of the communications function not in terms of amplification and solely messaging, but as that lateral integrator across the organization that is Prudential. When we met with Prudential's leadership at the beginning of this year, in January, so in a different eon, in almost a parallel universe at that point, pre-pandemic, we proposed and they agreed to these three core tenets that we believe are absolutely essential to the success of this ecosystem-based communications function. First, the unification of the professional family of communicators across Pru. When Lauren first arrived at Prudential 5 years ago, I believe actually 5 years ago this month, and even when I got there 3 years ago, our communications resources, as Ed mentioned in the story about the Baltimore fire, were rather fragmented. We had embedded teams in the businesses and functions, we had a centralized group, and we had a number of other teams scattered across the company that did bits and pieces. And so what we did in June of this year was to integrate them all into one global family of communicators. As you see here, aligned, both connected to the core and closely aligned with enterprise business strategy, but also it's still remaining embedded close to the businesses and functions and to customers and to other stakeholder groups, so that as opposed to the past where the core has known what the center thinks and understands its priorities, and the embedded teams out in the businesses and functions understand the local needs and priorities. The two were not sufficiently connected. Now we have a system that is end-to-end, where we have connectivity from the periphery right to the core, and vice versa. And the other thing, of course, money plays no small part in the success of a group like this. So we have basically zero-based the budget, and look to shift from a very heavily FTE, very heavily comp-based budget that doesn't allow us the kind of flexibility and fungibility that we need to put resources where they're needed most, and to be responsive and predictive or forecasting in terms of the company's needs. We are overhauling the budget entirely, so that it allows us to more easily flex and adapt as circumstances change. And then the third piece, which is one of the things that we are, I have the pleasure of leading execution on from here on out, is the negotiation of decision rights with regard to who gets to say yes and no to the continuation of work, the discontinuation of work, and the beginning of new projects. This is something that has been rather unclear within the walls of Prudential for a period of time. And so we have been working very closely again with the executive leadership team across Prudential, and just recently settled on a framework for the prioritization of the company's desired outcomes, as well as a framework for the prioritization of the deployment of communications resources across the company. And again, critically, this was something that was decided by the executive leadership team in consultation with communications, rather than the other way around.
Alan, at the risk of the extraneous noise that comes through my computer, I'd add the insight to prioritization was that we had a lot of people supporting business individuals, not businesses. And while your business leader is often the spokesperson for your business, there's critical work to untangle what is an initiative, what is a business outcome, what is bespoke service for an executive. And they had been muddled, and that was a critical insight to deploying that Alan worked on, that is critical to deploying prioritization in the right way.
That's right. Prudential traditionally has been a very bottom-up company in the way that it's been organized, in the way that it sets business strategy and priorities. That has changed quite dramatically. It's not that we have moved entirely, the pendulum has swung entirely over to top-down. It is a blend of the two. And so this prioritization framework allows us to balance local needs with enterprise priorities.
Sorry, that was me trying to advance slides. I think that's it.
So thank you so much, Alan and Lauren. We really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're all really busy, so we appreciate it. And then just if you could answer a question in 30 seconds or less, that would be great. But Christine Olson, my sister in Seattle, not my actual sister, but one of my sisters in Seattle, how has this new model changed your hiring profile? Will you upskill or bring in change agents for your, will you upskill current staff or bring in change agents?
We are doing both. I suspect that 3 years ago, Lauren had the vision to bring in change agents at that point. So this has been an experiment.
Alan was one of them.
Right. So Christine, the answer is absolutely yes. It's a blend of the two. We have a very interesting combination of folks who have been at Proof for some time that have amazing institutional knowledge with newer people like me from the outside world. And moving forward, we are going to be looking to do a lot of reskilling and upskilling within our team. We have an amazing bench of talent now, but we know that we do have talent gaps in some areas. And so upskilling and reskilling is going to be a major focus over the next 2 years as we implement this new model.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Alan and Lauren. We really appreciate it.